welcome to The Art of Being Human. There is an article I want to read to you. It's from Ann Landers. I don't even think she's alive now, but at any rate, she wrote an article to children and young people about what to do if they are abused. And I'm going to kind of close the section on abuse, except for the bullying, which I'm going to deal with in this segment, with this letter. And this is what she says. Tell somebody of any abuse. And I'm kind of reading it also for information for anyone who is presently being abused, any student, any person who's a young person that's being abused, or feel you're being abused, or you're not sure, but things are happening and you're not happy. And there's some advice that she gives here, and I think that it's so relevant that I've decided to read the whole article. It's in response to something that had been written to her. It's not long, but I think it's well worth listening to. So this is what she says. Well, this is what a 15-year-old says. Dear Ann Landers, I am a 15-year-old girl who has had a lot of experience with a sex abuser. My parents were divorced when I was 4, and I had to visit my father every weekend and 1 month in the summer. He began to abuse me when I was about 7 years old. I was so confused because he told me it was a father's place to teach his daughter how to love so that she could be a good wife. He made me promise never to tell anyone about our special secret. When I turned 11, I knew it was wrong, and I warned him to leave me alone or I would go to my mother and spill everything. He never touched me after that. Last spring, a wonderful teacher sensed that I was a loner, very insecure and withdrawn. She broke through the wall that I had built around myself. Once the floodgates were open, I told her everything that had happened to me. That dear woman arranged for me to have counseling, and now, after 6 months, I feel like a different person. And she goes on. If any child who is reading this, or in this case hearing this, has been sexually abused or is being sexually abused right now, please tell somebody about it. If you can't tell someone in your family, tell a teacher or someone at your church or a friend's mother. You must not let this awful thing go on. The best way to stop it is by telling. Remember, it's not your fault. You did nothing wrong. It started long before you were able to understand what was happening to you. Now, you see, in this situation, this is kind of like a typical situation. A child becomes abused, and they're groomed for it. And the abuser is saying, we have a special relationship, just you and I. Don't tell anybody. This is our little secret. And they groom them to be able to accept all kinds of sexual abuse. But the child inwardly knows that something's not right. She doesn't necessarily know what it is, depending upon what the age is, and it just continues and continues and continues until she has the strength to stand up and say, never again. If you touch me again, I'm going to spill the beans and tell everything. He leaves her alone. But the problem is now she's damaged. She's loner, she's isolated, she doesn't feel good, she doesn't have good relationships, she just does not know what to do now. She is kind of stuck in the results of what this abuse was. And then the sensitive teacher comes along and looking for things, not necessarily, staring at people and all of that, but just watching students' behavior. You can tell something's wrong. This child doesn't feel right. This child doesn't have enough friends. This child isn't behaving like a normal child. This child is behaving like maybe they've been abused. And she arranges and talks with the child and gets her to open up, and then the trust relationship is established between them. And then she actually tells the teacher, this is what happened to me. And then the teacher goes ahead and acts as the intervener, gets the counseling, gets her set up for help. In 6 months' time, she's feeling much better. This is why I wanted to spend time, both in the last segment and to a certain degree in this segment too, how do you know when a child is being abused? How do you know when something's wrong? And then what do you do about it after that? All child abuse has to be reported. It just has to be. But But you can do it anonymously. You don't have to give names and dates and this is what I do and all of that. You could do it anonymously, but it has to be reported. I know a lot of people have complained about the welfare system and taking kids away from the home. I've had some dealings with them, and I have to say that they have bent over backwards trying to help a child, and they have bent over backwards trying to help families stay together. It is not in their best interest to remove children from the home. They don't want to do it. But the home has got to be a safe place for a child. If it's not a safe place for a child, they can't be there because they can't thrive. And so what I like about this article is the fact that this 15-year-old comes around and says what's happened to her, gets the strength to say don't do it anymore, and then a teacher steps in, intervenes, and gets her the help that she needs. And then with the advice, if something is going on, and I echo that today, if something's going on in your life and it's not right and you're being abused or you think you're being abused and you're not feeling right, you need to tell somebody, because they can report it, they can intervene, they can step in and they can help you. And then the world will change after that and you can get well. It's hard to get well sometimes, it's a long process, but you can get well. And so for my final remark in terms of the abuse in the home, that tells somebody. Now I want to get into bullying. In bullying, this is a very serious problem. It is, and I'm going to kind of read a definition here. It is the repeated, systematic efforts to somehow inflict harm on a particular child through a physical attack, a verbal attack, or a social attack. In other words, sometimes a child will be attacked by everybody in the school or everybody in their class, and they're like the scapegoat. They get blamed for everything. But sometimes it's a family thing, older children abusing younger children. It's a repeated thing, and it can go on for years at a time. It can go on, especially in a school system. I notice that as schools have shut down to the pandemic, that reporting of child abuse has gotten less and less and less and less. And what authorities are afraid of is that children are being abused at home, but nobody's stepping in. They're not going to school, so they can't go to a teacher because they're not seeing the teacher, or the teacher's not there in order to assess how the child is behaving. And so therefore a lot of abuse and bullying is just not being reported as it should be. But it is something that has to be reported, and it's a form of abuse, and children need to have protection from it. They need to be able to go to a teacher or somebody and say, this is what's happening to me. Now a lot of it is kicking, punching, stealing lunch money and stuff like that on a particular child, making fun of them, kicking them, even telling them to commit suicide. And unfortunately, there are a lot of children that have committed suicide because they can't take it anymore. But they're not telling anybody. The reason they're not telling anybody is that they're afraid they're going to get it worse. They're afraid they're not going to be believed. And then they think they just have to deal with it the best that they can and somehow get through it. But it causes depression, anxiety, it causes a lot of problems. I know when I was teaching in school, I dealt with students who were abusers, and I dealt with students who were being abused. And there was one particular teacher, I had kind of a deal with him. There is a child that he had that had some cognitive problems, and she would not realize when she was being abused, but the teacher sure did, and he was a good teacher. He came to me and said, this is what's happening in my class. So he made an arrangement. I would take the child out of the class just to talk to her every so often. I think we did this maybe 3 or 4 times a year. And I would hold her in my office, and we would just have a chat. And then he would go after the rest of the class and say, you know, you're doing this, you're doing this, you're doing this. I can see it. It's going to stop now. We will not put up with it. and that would put an end to it until we needed to do it again. This poor child wasn't able physiologically or cognitively to be able to report much. She had some difficulties in cognition, so it was hard for her to understand what was going on. And if she was being talked about or people were making fun of her or whatever it was, he could spot it, I could spot it, but she would just be stuck in it. And so we put a stop to it. It is possible to stop bullying. It is possible to do that. But the school has to be set up for it. A lot of times now, there are seminars on bullying. When children go to school, when they're old enough to understand more than when they're real young, they have seminars on how to treat people. And if you're not treating a person right, then they get called on for it and they get dealt with. But here's another thing. As a teacher, if you have a child that is abusing other children and you know it, you can intervene and stop it. But what about the person who's doing the abusing? What about the person who's doing the bullying? They're probably getting bullied at home. And what you have to remember is punishment to stop something sometimes isn't the way to go. Because sometimes if you punish somebody for doing something, you know, you have to stay after school or whatever the punishment is, when the parents get a hold of that, they punish them twice as bad. And in effect, they increase the bullying of their own child, who then turns to bully another child in a school. So you can't just, you know, you grit your teeth sometimes trying to figure out what the best thing to do. The best thing to do is to counsel each. You counsel a child to be able to stand up to it, and you also reassure them that it's not their fault. They didn't do anything wrong. They didn't do anything to cause it. And then you deal with the bullier. What's going on at home? Why does he or she want to bully? Why does she or he want to have such control? Why does he or she want to treat other students in a way that's not very good, that's despicable? And you work with that. And you can have group seminars, or you can have group meetings, and you can do all kinds of things to help stop it. It has to stop. Children have committed suicide because of it, and it just has to stop. The verbal attacks are usually going to be teasing and taunting and name-calling, and the school attack, there is a social attack that can go on, and that would be not allowing them in social activities, making fun of them, or making fun of somebody, or it's your fault, our team didn't make it, et cetera, et cetera. It's an ongoing thing, and you have to have the eyes of an eagle, I guess, to be able to catch it all. There is an imbalance of power. The weaker victims are those that are getting attacked by the stronger victims, and boys tend to use more physical attacks, kicking, punching, hitting, stuff like that. Girls tend to be more verbal, sarcastic, making accusations against the person who's weaker. The victims can be signaled out because they themselves don't have as much power. They're not as strong. And what you get is an attack on them by those that are stronger. But you know, in a way, it acts against the bullier because more boys bully than girls. But when they get to a certain point, sometimes they're admired because kids who feel weaker want to kind of be closer to them. They're closer to the source of power. But then after a while, kids get tired of it. After a while, they look around and they don't like what they see out of this person who's bullying, and they tend to stay away from them. So in a sense, what the bullier thought was making him very popular has caused him to have less friends because people are drawing away. Other children are beginning to see the truth about what's going on, and then they will pull away, and they find the bullier tends to find themselves more isolated. It's also true that those who are bullied, as they grow up, they tend to have more jail sentences. They tend to be convicted of more crimes. And so therefore it's just something that it has to be worked on. So a lot of people, just as an example of bullying, a child that is forced to hand over lunch money or to drink milk that has laundry detergent in it. I mean, just real mean stuff. It has to stop. And no one comes to the child's defense. Now, what happens when you have people like school shootings and this and that, where you get a lot of violence? People who are bullied, who draw into themselves and can't defend themselves, and nobody comes to their defense. No one stands up for them. What happens to them? They get ingrown. They get involved, and everything is in them. You have inward aggression and you have outward aggression. And for a while, all of the anxieties go inward, and these children become sullen and they're quiet, but they're also getting angry. And then at some point, they start to explode, and everything comes out at the same time. And then you have a school shooting. Now, we've had a lot of problems with riots through the Pandora thing that's going on now, and because of deaths of people, and people are becoming violent and getting in the streets and having riots and all of that. There is the idea that if you can't change a situation, if something's going on in society that is unfair, and a group of people know that, lots of people know that, but they feel powerless to do anything about it, because even when they try to make inroads and say, this has got to change and this has got to change, and it doesn't happen, they get to the point where they get enraged. Helplessness and hopelessness will turn into rage, not just anger, but rage. And then the explosion comes from that. And then you get shootings from that and riots from that. A lot of things you see that we have going on in society today are due to the fact that segments of society feel unheard and unhelped. And if people can get together, and bullying is a part of this, by the way, and if you can get together and talk about things, this is what we need to have change. What can we do to make you feel more comfortable? How can we change our behavior so that you're included? So much better than you're doing this wrong, stop it or else. You see, there's a time when violence only begets violence. Violence as a reaction to violence doesn't work. It only causes more violence. And then you get into that inevitable cycle. I am doing something to you because somebody did something to me. And then you're doing something to me and other people because somebody did something to you. And it was all unresolved. And that's not the way life is supposed to be. It's not the way that we are supposed to be. So therefore, bullying becomes a big issue. And I'm glad to see schools really trying to help out with that. Children who are bullied, they become anxious, they become depressed, they are underachieving, they have low self-esteem, and I am going to be getting into a self-esteem issue probably in the next segment, or I'll be starting it. How do you know when a child has a bad self-esteem? How is that going to influence their schoolwork? How is that going to influence their peer relationships, their relationships with their friends? How can that be improved? If we're having this segment here, which I'm almost to the end of it now, but if we have this whole segment on how to help children through their illnesses and how to help children through their crises, then you've got to take into consideration that after you get into a crisis, there's got to be a way out. And the way out has got to be something other than more violence, more bullying, more fights, and just has to be a better situation. And so plans have to be laid out. We discuss, we talk, we come to conclusions, and we hold people to a certain higher standard. And then we watch and make sure that that higher standard is being upheld. And we try to get till we understand where another person is coming from. If I have a child in my class and they're sullen and they're quiet, I'm going to immediately think that something's wrong. because children don't normally act that way. Now, that doesn't mean that some children aren't quiet, but are they quiet and they're sullen and they stay away and they're fearful? What's going on at home? What's going on the playground? Why are some children like that? How are other children behaving toward them? How can we make it better? It's much better taking an approach, a psychological approach, and I'm not saying psychology takes care of everything, I don't believe that myself, but we have to do something more than just exert more and more violence to stop violence. And bullying, we can't bully in order to stop bullying. You know, to stop bullying, I can't bully somebody so they will stop bullying somebody else. But I can take them into my office and I can talk with them and say, what are you getting out of this? What's the reason that you're doing this? How can it be made so that you're more comfortable not doing it than you are doing it? What do you need other students to do with you and for you to help you to feel included? And that includes adults too, because there are segments of adults where people are turning on each other and hurting each other. How can we stop that? Now, I don't think psychology has the answer to everything. I've never believed it. But on the other hand, continuing in the same kind of way, doing the same kinds of things isn't working either. There has to be a better approach. By age 24, 2/3 of bullies in the 2nd grade have already been convicted of a felony. Something has to stop here. And 1/3 of those who have been bullied in the 6th grade, which is basically 12th graders, they were convicted for 3 years or so because of crimes they committed. We have a very punitive society and people are blamed for everything. But it comes to the point where we have to do something that's different in order to stop the bullying. So people who are victims of bullying, they have fewer friends, they're nervous, they're less secure, and a lot of times their parents are bullies too. So there's a lot of physical punishment in homes of people who are bullying. Now I see we're kind of running out of time, so I'm going to close it here, and then we will go on into self-concept, how to help people to have a healthy but not arrogant self-concept, how to help people adjust where they should, be strong where they should, so they can have a much better lifestyle, and then we'll be going on to something else from there. So we'll close it here. Please join me next time.